The galaxy had forgotten what silence sounded like. For 300 cycles, the hegemony wars had raged across 12 star systems, consuming worlds like a hungering beast that could never be satisfied. In the dying light of distant suns, civilizations rose and fell with the regularity of tides, some lasting mere seasons, others enduring just long enough to watch their children grow before the inevitable came calling. But on the outer rim world of Kethmoray, beneath twin moons that cast silver shadows across crystalline spires, the Veltar had dared to hope for something different. They were wrong. The first sign of doom came not as a roar, but as whispers in the quantum void. Sefak pressed his six-fingered hand against the observation deck's transparency, watching the stars flicker like dying embers. His compound eyes evolved over millennia to see across 7 spectrums, caught the subtle distortions that others missed. Space itself was bending, twisting in ways that violated every natural law his people had spent centuries documenting. "The sensors are malfunctioning again," came the voice behind him, melodic yet strained with exhaustion. Kialara moved with the fluid grace typical of her species, but even she couldn't hide the tremor in her elongated limbs. The war had aged them all. "No malfunction," HFY replied, his voice carrying harmonics that humans would later describe as hauntingly beautiful. "They come." The words hung in the recycled atmosphere like a death sentence. Kialara's breathing apparatus, a gossamer film that covered the lower portion of her face, misted with rapid exhalations. The Gorthani Collective. Here. But the outer defenses were designed by architects who never faced a true predator. HFY turned from the viewport, his ceremonial robes rustling like autumn leaves. As Prime Speaker of the Veltar Confederation, he had guided his people through famines, stellar phenomena, and political upheavals that would have shattered lesser civilizations. But this was different. How long until they breached the perimeter? 18 hours. Maybe 20 if our patrol squadrons can. 23 minutes? The new voice cut through their conversation like a plasma blade through silk. Morden stood in the doorway, his warriors bearing, unable to disguise the defeat etched into every line of his battle-scarred form. Where other Veltar possessed the willowy elegance of their kind, Morden had been shaped by conflict into something harder, a blade forged in the crucible of endless war. 23 minutes? He repeated, his words weighted with the authority of someone who had never been wrong about such things. Long-range sensors show 7 Devastator-class dreadnoughts, 43 heavy cruisers, and approximately 200 smaller vessels. Their quantum signatures. He paused, his throat sacs pulsing with emotion he refused to voice. They're using living ships, biotech fused with dark matter engines. The silence that followed was deafening. Kialara's scientific mind processed the implications faster than her emotional capacity could handle them. Living ships meant self-repair, adaptation, evolution in real-time combat scenarios. Dark matter engines suggested technology that shouldn't exist, shouldn't be possible, yet somehow was. Combined with the Gorthani Collective's reputation for creativity in their methods of conquest, the mathematics painted a picture too horrific to contemplate. Evacuation protocols. HFY asked, though they all knew the answer. 18 billion souls on Kethmoray alone. Morden replied. The fastest transports we possess would require 6 months to evacuate even 10% of our population. Our defensive fleet numbers fewer than 30 ships, most of them merchant vessels with jury-rigged weapons. We have enough orbital platforms to perhaps delay them for, perhaps an hour. Then we fight. And we die. Morden's compound eyes fixed on his prime speaker with something approaching respect. But yes, we fight. In the deepest vaults beneath the Veltar capital, ancient machines hummed to life for the first time in 10,000 years. The emergency conclave had been a theoretical construct, something spoken of in hushed tones by historians and theoretical strategists. Now, as representatives from 17 different species gathered in the ceremonial chamber, the weight of its activation pressed down on them like a collapsing star. The Shakani delegate, a Tripelbian whose crystalline exoskeleton reflected the chamber's ambient light in prismatic patterns, spoke first. The collective has never struck this deep into protected space. Why now? Why us? Because we're alone. The answer came from HFY, whose aquatic species had been forced to wear mobility suits after their homeworld's oceans were boiled away 3 cycles past. The Terran hegemony promised protection, swore it in words that carried the weight of their ancestors' honor. But where are they now? Murmurs rippled through the assembly, some bitter, others desperate. The humans have their own battles, HFY said carefully. Intelligence reports suggest they're engaged in a major offensive against the Korvac Empire in the Centauri sector. 7 of their primary fleet. 7 fleets. Severhi's suit speakers crackled with static that couldn't quite mask his disdain. They have 23 active fleets. 23. And not one can be spared for allies who honored their treaties, who stood beside them when the Void Touch attacked their colonies. Enough. The voice belonged to Teshvara, eldest of the assembled delegates and one of the few beings present who remembered a time before the wars. Her species aged slowly, accumulating wisdom like sedimentary layers, and when she spoke, others listened. Blame serves no purpose now. The question remains, do we stand together or do we scatter like leaves before the storm? The vote, when it came, was unanimous. They would stand. They would fight. They would die as one people, rather than perish as fragments. 3,000 light-years away, in a solar system whose 3rd planet still bore scars from an ancient nuclear war, Captain Daniel Cross stood before a holographic display that showed the slow death of civilizations. The command bridge of the human dreadnought Indomitable was a study in controlled chaos. Officers moved with practiced efficiency between stations that monitored everything from quantum flux readings to the metabolic rates of the ship's 12,000 crew members. But beneath the professional veneer, Cross could sense the tension that had been building for weeks. "Sir," came the voice of his communications officer, Lieutenant Commander Lisa Park. Her words carried the crisp precision of someone who had learned to deliver bad news without flinching. "We're receiving transmission updates from the Veltar Confederation. The situation has deteriorated." Cross turned from the tactical display, his weathered features betraying nothing of the storm brewing behind steel-gray eyes. At 53, he had commanded vessels in 17 major engagements, seen civilizations rise and fall, watched friends die and enemies surrender. But something about this particular conflict gnawed at him in ways the others hadn't. "Show me." The main display flickered, replaced by images that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Ketimrai hung in space like a jewel, its crystalline cities catching and refracting starlight in patterns that seemed almost musical. But even from this distance, the sensors could detect the massive fleet formations moving toward it, dark shapes that seemed to devour light itself. "The Gorthani Collective," Park continued, her voice dropping to the tone reserved for funeral services. "Intelligence estimates they'll reach Veltar space in 14 hours, 17 minutes. And our orders remain unchanged?" "Yes, sir." Admiral Kingston's directive was explicit. "Maintain current heading toward the Korvac stronghold at Sigma Draconis. Under no circumstances are we to deviate from—" "I know what the orders were, Commander." Cross's words carried an edge that made several bridge officers look up from their stations. "The question is whether they're the right orders." The bridge fell silent except for the steady hum of life support systems and the subtle vibration of the ship's massive engines. Everyone present understood the implications of what their captain was considering. Disobeying direct orders during wartime carried consequences that made simple court-martial seem pleasant. "Sir," came a new voice from the navigation station. Lieutenant James Fisher was young, barely 25, but possessed an intuitive grasp of stellar mechanics that bordered on the supernatural. "If I may, the Veltar saved my sister's colony on Proxima Bay. When the plague ships came, they didn't hesitate. They didn't calculate odds or wait for authorization. They just came." More silence. Cross studied the display, watching as probability calculations scrolled past in columns of amber light. The numbers were brutal in their honesty. 30 Veltar ships against over 200 collective vessels. It wouldn't be a battle, it would be an execution. "How long to reach Keth Morai at maximum burn?" he asked quietly. 16 hours, 22 minutes, Fisher replied immediately. "But sir, the fuel reserves required would leave us unable to reach our assigned target. And the Korvac will still be there when we're done." Cross turned to face his assembled officers. seeing his own doubts reflected in their expressions. I've received a lot of orders in my career. Some were brilliant. Some were necessary. Some were both. But the order to abandon our allies while they face extinction. He paused, choosing his words with the care of a surgeon making a critical incision. That's not an order I can follow. Park stepped forward, her expression serious but not surprised. Sir, if we do this, there's no going back. Admiral Kingston will have us all court-martialed, assuming we survive to face trial. I know. Cross looked around the bridge one more time, studying faces that had become as familiar as family over their 3 years together. Which is why I'm not ordering anyone to come with me. This is volunteer duty only. Anyone who wants to follow regulations can transfer to the escort ships. No questions asked, no mark on their record. The seconds stretched into eternity. Then Fisher spoke up. With respect, sir, where the hell else would we go? A chorus of agreement rippled across the bridge. Not voices, but the subtle sounds of crews settling deeper into their stations. Hands moving to controls with renewed purpose, and the quiet certainty of people who had found their line in the sand. Very well. Cross moved to his command chair, feeling the weight of decision settle around him like armor. All hands. This is the captain. Lay in a course for the Kathmarai system, maximum burn, and signal the fleet. Anyone who doesn't want to face what's coming can break off now with my blessing. The response came in the form of engine signatures. 7 additional ships adjusting their headings to match the Indomitable's new course. Not one vessel broke away. In the deepest reaches of space, where starlight was a distant memory and the cosmic background radiation whispered secrets older than worlds, something stirred. The Gorthani collective had many names across the galaxy. The Veltar called them devourers of light. The aquatic Jekani knew them as those who make the void hungry. But among the humans, they had earned a simpler, more direct title, the Plague. Sikthar, battle speaker of the 7th Swarm, felt the familiar rush of anticipation as his living ship's sensory organs detected the approach to their target system. His vessel, a hybrid of biotechnology and dark matter engineering that defied conventional understanding, pulsed with eager hunger around him. Unlike the elegant architecture of Veltar ships or the brutal functionality of human military vessels, collective ships were grown rather than built. They possessed nervous systems, circulatory networks that pumped exotic matter instead of blood, and sensory arrays that could perceive reality across dimensions that other species didn't even know existed. The prey worlds show signs of panic, reported his sub-speaker, Vorthag, whose cranial modifications allowed direct interface with the ship's neural network. Their defense grids are powering up, but their fleet strength remains amusing. Sektar's mandibles clicked in what passed for laughter among his kind. The Gorthani had evolved on a world where predation was the only path to survival, where cooperation was a temporary expedient at best, and betrayal was simply good strategy. They understood violence in ways that civilized species found incomprehensible. Have they sent their traditional surrender offers? He asked, already knowing the answer. The usual platitudes about mercy, quarter for non-combatants, preservation of cultural artifacts. Buffetzig's tone carried the dismissive amusement of a cat discussing mice. They offer tribute, vassalage, anything if we spare their spawning worlds. And their Terran allies? No response to our sensor sweeps. Their fleets remain committed to the Korvac front. Intelligence suggests they may not even know of our offensive. Perfect. Sekthar had studied human military doctrine extensively, a professional necessity when facing opponents whose tactical thinking differed so dramatically from one's own. Humans were peculiar. They possessed individual combat skills that bordered on the supernatural, yet their strategic thinking remained frustratingly predictable. Honor codes, rules of engagement, concern for non-combatants that made them hesitate at critical moments. The collective had no such weaknesses. Signal the fleet, he commanded, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the ship's living walls. We begin harvesting in 6 hours. And Vorthag, ensure the biotechnology teams are prepared. The Veltar possess certain genetic advantages that should not be wasted. As his ship and its attendant swarm continued their inexorable approach toward Kathmarai, Sektar allowed himself a moment of anticipation, Soon another world would join the collective. Another species would contribute their unique biological advantages to the great project of galactic evolution. Resistance was not merely futile. It was counterproductive. On Kethmore, in a bunker buried 3 kilometers beneath the planet's surface, HFY stood before a communication array that hadn't been used in decades. The quantum entanglement communicator was a relic from the early days of Veltar space exploration, a device capable of instantaneous communication across galactic distances, but so energy-intensive that it could only be used in the direst emergencies. This qualified. "Are you certain the Terran hegemony will receive the transmission?" Kalara asked, her scientific skepticism warring with desperate hope. "The quantum frequencies are still synchronized with their primary communication networks," HFY replied, checking readings on displays that flickered between languages as the ancient systems struggled to accommodate modern interfaces. "Whether they choose to respond, that is beyond our control." The message itself had been crafted with the care typically reserved for poetry or prayer. It contained technical specifications of the approaching collective fleet, tactical assessments of defensive capabilities, and population statistics that reduced 18 billion lives to data points. But beneath the clinical language lay something more fundamental. "We have honored our treaties. We stood beside you when your colonies burned. We ask not for salvation but for the chance to die as allies rather than strangers." As the transmission fired across the galaxy at speeds that made light seem sluggish, HFY found himself thinking about the humans he had met during the Proxima crisis. They had seemed so similar to his own people, curious, idealistic, driven by principles that often conflicted with practical necessities. Yet there had been something else, something that only became apparent in moments of extreme stress. When cornered, when facing impossible odds, when civilization itself hung in the balance, humans didn't retreat, they attacked. "Message sent," Kalara announced, her voice barely audible above the hum of cooling systems working overtime. "Now we wait." Above them, piercing the planet's atmosphere like daggers of concentrated malevolence, the first collective scouts began their descent toward the surface. Time became a weapon that cut both ways. The collective advance had been precisely calculated, a symphony of destruction choreographed across multiple dimensions. Each vessel in Sekathar's fleet moved with the inexorable certainty of gravity itself, following trajectories that would maximize psychological impact while minimizing defensive effectiveness. But calculations, no matter how precise, could not account for the variable of hope. 18 hours before the massacre was scheduled to begin, the quantum void erupted with signals that changed everything. Morden was the first to detect them. His warrior's instincts, honed by decades of conflict, recognized the signature harmonics of human 50L engines. Long before the sensors could resolve actual ships, he stood in the Orbital Defense Command Center, surrounded by tactical displays that painted space in shades of probability and death when the impossible happened. "Contact bearing 27 Mark IV, announced the sensor operator, her voice carrying the strangled hope of someone who had given up on miracles. "Quantum signature. Designation. Terran hegemony. Dreadnought class. Single vessel, running silent until now." The main display flickered, resolving into an image that would be remembered for generations. Emerging from behind Kethmore's largest moon came a ship that seemed to embody human military philosophy in steel and ceramic composites. Where Veltar vessels curved like living things and collective ships writhed with organic menace, the Indomitable possessed the angular brutality of a weapon designed by people who understood that war was ultimately about making the other side stop fighting. 2 kilometers of armor plating and weapon emplacements, bristling with technologies that pushed the boundaries of physics. Railguns capable of accelerating projectiles to significant fractions of light speed. Plasma cannons that could turn asteroids into vapor. Most terrifyingly, the distinctive sensor signature of quantum torpedoes, weapons that didn't simply destroy their targets, but erased them from existence on a fundamental level. "Are they responding to our transmission?" someone asked, though the question felt almost blasphemous in the face of what they were witnessing. Morden studied the tactical readouts with the careful attention of someone whose survival had always depended on understanding enemy capabilities. "Their approach vector suggests they've been en route for at least 16 hours. They began their journey before our message could have reached them." The implications settled over the command center like a benediction. Humans didn't wait for distress calls to help their allies. They simply came. On the bridge of the Indomitable, Captain Cross watched probability calculations scroll across multiple displays while trying to reconcile duty with reality. Tactical assessment, Commander Park. Park's fingers moved across her console with the fluid precision of a pianist performing a familiar concerto, calling up data that transformed the approaching battle into mathematics. Collective fleet disposition: 7 Devastator-class dreadnoughts, 43 heavy cruisers, 216 smaller vessels, combined firepower equivalent to approximately 12 times our maximum output, and that assumes their biotech ships don't adapt mid-battle, added Lieutenant Fisher from the navigation station. Intelligence reports suggest collective vessels can evolve new defensive configurations in real time. Cross nodded grimly. The numbers were clear: 8 human ships against over 260 collective vessels. Even accounting for technological advantages and superior training, the mathematics of the engagement were unforgiving. "Sir," came a new voice from the communications station. "We're receiving transmission from the Veltar Orbital Command. They're requesting clarification of our intentions." "Put them through." The main display flickered, replaced by the elongated features of Mordun. Even across the gulf of species and culture, the warrior's bearing was unmistakable. Someone who had faced death often enough to speak with it as an old acquaintance. "Captain Cross," Mordun said, his translated voice carrying harmonics that suggested deep respect. "Your arrival is unexpected. We had not requested assistance." "No," Cross replied simply. "You hadn't, but you shouldn't have needed to." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with all the weight of treaties and alliances, of shared battles and mutual sacrifices. "The tactical situation is Corvaxed." Mordun paused, searching for diplomatic language to describe a mathematical impossibility. "Challenging. The collective fleet possesses overwhelming numerical superiority. Perhaps it would be wiser for your forces to withdraw and preserve." "We're not leaving." Cross's words carried the finality of a closing tomb. "The question is whether you're willing to fight alongside us." Another pause, longer this time. "Captain," Mordun said finally, his compound eyes reflecting emotions that transcended species barriers, "it would be an honor." In the depths of space, Siktar studied the new tactical situation with the calculating regard of a predator confronting unexpected prey. The arrival of human forces had been interesting. His bioneural implants processed probability matrices faster than conventional computers, and the results were both encouraging and concerning. 8 ships could not meaningfully alter the outcome of the battle, but humans possessed a talent for causing disproportionate damage through application of tactics that bordered on the suicidal. "Analysis," he demanded from his sub-speakers, his mandibles clicking with barely contained excitement. "Single dreadnought, 7 escort vessels," reported Vorthag, neural cables pulsing as he interfaced directly with the swarm's collective intelligence. "Standard Terran military configuration, likely commanded by a senior captain with combat experience. Their positioning suggests they intend to make a fighting withdrawal while covering Veltar evacuation efforts." "Evacuation?" Sektar's laughter was a sound like breaking glass. "There will be no evacuation. Signal all vessels. Advance the timetable. We begin the harvest in 2 hours." The order rippled through the swarm's bioneural network, causing hundreds of living ships to shiver with anticipation. Collective vessels were grown in the heart of dying stars, their hulls incorporating exotic matter that existed in dimensions beyond normal space-time. When they moved together, reality itself seemed to bend around them. But Sektar had not risen to battle-speaker rank through recklessness. Human military doctrine emphasized what their scholars called force multiplication, the ability to achieve effects far beyond apparent capabilities through superior training, technology, and most dangerously, unpredictability. "What do we know of their commanding officer?" he asked. "Captain Daniel Cross, commanding officer of the TNV Indomitable," Warthag replied, accessing files that had been compiled over years of conflict. 17 major engagements, including the Proxima Crisis and the Siege of New Byzantium. Tactical assessment: highly aggressive, willing to accept casualties to achieve objectives. Psychological profiles suggest strong attachment to abstract concepts such as honor and duty. Perfect. Predictable humans with their predictable weaknesses. Deploy the Wraith-class interceptors to probe their defenses. Sektar commanded. I want to know exactly what we're facing before we commit to full assault. As his orders propagated through the swarm, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Soon he would add human bio-neural patterns to the collective's vast library. Their peculiar talent for violence would serve the greater evolution of the galaxy. After all, even apex predators could be harvested. The first skirmish began not with the roar of weapons but with the whisper of sensors detecting targets that shouldn't exist. Lieutenant Fisher was the first to spot them. 17 contacts materializing from what had appeared to be empty space. Their quantum signatures so faint as to be barely distinguishable from background radiation. Captain, I'm reading multiple contacts on an intercept course. They're using some kind of stealth technology I've never seen before. Cross studied the tactical display with the cold focus of someone who had learned to process information faster than fear. The approaching vessels were small, fighter-sized, but their sensor profiles suggested technologies that violated several fundamental laws of physics. Weapons status. All systems online and ready, reported the tactical officer. But sir, those ships, they're phasing in and out of normal space-time. Our targeting computers can't maintain lock. Then we do this the old-fashioned way. Cross's voice carried across the bridge with the calm authority of someone issuing dinner invitations rather than battle orders. All ships, this is actual. Prepare for close engagement. Manual targeting only. And remember, we're not here to win, we're here to buy time. The Wraith-class interceptors struck with the lethal grace of sharks attacking a wounded seal. Their weapons plasma beams that existed partially outside normal dimensional constraints, carved through space in patterns that seemed to bend light itself. But the humans had faced impossible enemies before. The Indomitable and our escorts responded with tactics that would have been considered war crimes if applied against conventional opponents. Railgun salvos that turned space into a storm of relativistic projectiles. Plasma cannons that painted the void in shades of artificial lightning. And beneath it all, the steady pulse of quantum torpedoes, weapons that didn't merely destroy but negated the very concept of existence. The first Wraith-class interceptor died in a burst of exotic matter that briefly turned a cubic kilometer of space into something resembling the heart of a neutron star. The second and third followed within microseconds, caught in the crossfire of weapons that had been designed by people who understood that survival sometimes required embracing overkill as a philosophical principle. But the remaining interceptors adapted. Their bio-neural systems processed the attack patterns, evolved countermeasures, developed new tactics in real time. What had been surprise became routine. What had been effective became merely dangerous. They're learning, Park reported, her voice carrying the clinical detachment of someone providing updates on a terminal diagnosis. Adapting to our weapons signatures, adjusting their phase variants to avoid targeting solutions. Cross watched the tactical display with growing unease. This was the nightmare scenario that kept human strategists awake at night, facing an enemy that could evolve faster than tactics could be developed. But humans had advantages that went beyond technology. All ships, switch to Pattern 7, he commanded. Pattern 7 wasn't in any official tactical manual. It had been developed during the Proxima crisis by officers who had run out of conventional options and discovered that sometimes the best strategy was controlled madness. Ships broke formation, abandoned coordinated fire patterns, and began attacking with the random fury of berserkers. The collective interceptors, whose bio-neural networks were designed to process and counter systematic tactics, found themselves facing something they couldn't adapt to: pure, weaponized chaos. The remaining Wraith-class ships died in a storm of weapons fire that painted space in colors that had no names. But their sacrifice had served its purpose. Now Sektar knew exactly what he was facing. In the command bunkers beneath Kathmorai's surface, HFY watched the battle unfold through sensors that translated death into data points. The human vessels are remarkable, Kilara said, her scientific mind struggling to process tactics that seemed to violate every principle of strategic doctrine. Their coordination patterns suggest individual ship commanders are operating with near-complete autonomy. yet achieving collective effects that surpass conventional fleet structures. It's not their tactics, Mordun replied from his position at the tactical display. His warrior's insight had always exceeded his ability to explain it, but the patterns were clear to anyone who understood combat at a fundamental level. It's their hatred. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Hatred? HFY asked. Watch how they fight, Mordun said, highlighting specific engagement sequences on the display. Every movement, every weapon discharge, every tactical decision. It's personal. They're not fighting to defend territory or preserve strategic assets. They're fighting to kill, to make the enemy stop existing. The observation was troubling for reasons that went beyond mere tactical analysis. The Veltar had always prided themselves on their philosophical approach to conflict, violence as a regrettable necessity to be applied with precision and concluded as quickly as possible. But the humans seemed to approach war as an art form, a creative endeavor where the goal was not merely victory but the complete annihilation of opposition. Sir, came a voice from the communications station. We're receiving tactical data from the human fleet. Battle plans, sensor readings, projected engagement timelines. They're sharing everything. Zephinthus studied the incoming data with growing amazement. Military intelligence of this sensitivity should have been classified at levels requiring decades of alliance building to access. Yet the humans were transmitting it freely, as if the concept of withholding information from allies was literally incomprehensible. They trust us completely, he said finally. No, Mordun corrected, his compound eyes reflecting the tactical display's amber glow. They don't trust us at all. They're assuming we're going to die, and they want our deaths to matter. The main collective fleet arrived like a plague of living stars. Sekthar's flagship emerged from its dimensional fold first, a vessel that defied every conventional understanding of physics and aesthetics. Where human ships were angular and Velatar vessels curved, collective dreadnoughts writhed. Their hulls incorporated biological components that pulsed with alien life, while their weapon systems existed partially outside normal spacetime. Behind it came the rest of the swarm. 260 vessels that had been grown rather than built, evolved rather than designed. They moved in patterns that seemed almost organic, like a school of predatory fish responding to stimuli that existed beyond conventional sensory input. All human vessels, this is the Indomitable. Quas's voice carried across the communication channels with the steady calm of someone reading technical manuals rather than facing annihilation. You know the drill. Make them pay for every meter. Make them regret coming here. The response came not in words but in the subtle adjustments of formation and the steady hum of weapons charging. 8 ships against more than 200. The mathematics were unforgiving, but mathematics had never been humanity's strongest subject. The battle began in earnest when the first collective dreadnought fired its primary weapon, a beam of concentrated dark matter that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously. The target, a human destroyer, simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed or vaporized, but negated on a fundamental level that made recovery impossible. The human response was immediate and personal. Every ship in the small fleet focused fire on the offending dreadnought, pouring energy into its hull with the concentrated fury of people who had just watched friends die. Railgun slugs traveling at 20% light speed, plasma bolts that turned sections of armor into briefly existing stars, and finally, from the Indomitable itself, a full spread of quantum torpedoes. The collective dreadnought absorbed punishment that should have destroyed a dozen conventional vessels. Its bioneural hull adapted, evolved, developed new defensive configurations in real time. But even evolutionary perfection had limits. The quantum torpedoes struck simultaneously, each warhead erasing approximately 1 cubic kilometer of reality from existence. The dreadnought's adaptive systems tried to compensate but found themselves attempting to evolve defenses against weapons that attacked the very concept of existence itself. The death of something that large should not have been silent, but when the explosions faded and the exotic matter dissipated, there was simply nothing. Empty space where 700 meters of living ship had existed moments before. First blood to us, Park reported, her voice carrying satisfaction that was probably inappropriate for the circumstances. But sir, they're adapting to the quantum torpedoes. The next salvo won't be as effective. Cross nodded grimly. Human weapons had always possessed one critical advantage over enemy technology. They were designed by people who understood that sometimes the best solution was massive overkill. But that advantage diminished rapidly when facing opponents who could evolve countermeasures in real time. Signal all ships, he commanded. Time to show them what we learned during the Void-touched war. What followed would be studied in military academies for centuries, assuming there were academies left to study it. The humans abandoned every principle of conventional fleet tactics and descended into what historians would later describe as orchestrated madness. Individual ships broke formation and began operating independently, each captain choosing targets and engagement patterns based on personal preference rather than strategic coordination. To outside observers, it appeared to be the complete breakdown of military discipline. The collective bio-neural networks, designed to process and counter systematic tactics, struggled to adapt to what seemed like random aggression. But there was a pattern beneath the chaos. A form of collective consciousness that operated below the level of conscious thought. Each human captain knew, without communication or coordination, exactly where their fellow ships were and what they were doing. Weapons fire that should have struck friendly vessels somehow found gaps in formation that shouldn't have existed. Attack runs that appeared suicidal managed to avoid catastrophic collisions through adjustments measured in microseconds and meters. They're operating as a single organism, Forfak reported to Sektar, his bio-neural implants struggling to process tactical patterns that defied analysis. Individual units making autonomous decisions, yet achieving collective effects that surpass theoretical maximum efficiency. Sekthar's mandibles clicked with frustrated admiration. Human military doctrine had always been their most inexplicable characteristic, capable of producing results that violated every principle of strategic theory. But this went beyond doctrine into something approaching the supernatural. Concentrate fire on their flagship, he commanded. Remove their command structure and the coordination will collapse. 7 collective dreadnoughts focused their primary weapons on the Indomitable, pouring enough energy into its position to sterilize a small moon. But the human ship wasn't there when the beams converged. It had shifted position in a maneuver that should have been impossible given its momentum and trajectory. Instead, the Indomitable had somehow positioned itself behind 3 collective cruisers, its weapons already firing at targets that couldn't maneuver quickly enough to avoid the attack. The railgun salvos struck with surgical precision, targeting bio-neural nodes and exotic matter conduits with accuracy that suggested intimate knowledge of collective ship design. How did they know? Borthag asked, his voice carrying the strain of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality were being systematically demolished. Sekthar studied the tactical display with growing unease. The humans weren't just fighting, they were learning. Each engagement revealed new information about collective weapons tactics and ship design, information that was immediately shared across their entire fleet and incorporated into attack patterns. But more troubling was the realization that human accuracy was improving with each exchange. Not gradually, as would be expected from conventional targeting computers, but exponentially, as if their weapons systems were somehow anticipating where collective ships would be rather than reacting to where they were. Battle speaker, came an urgent transmission from one of the outer picket ships. We're detecting massive energy signatures from the planet's surface. The Valtar are powering up. Some 3 kilometers beneath Kethmarai's surface, Kelaras stood before a device that hadn't been activated in 12,000 years. The Veltar planetary defense grid had been theoretical when it was constructed. A last resort so devastating that its creators had hoped it would never be needed. Now, as ancient systems hummed to life around her, she wondered if they had been naive to build something so powerful without considering the consequences of actually using it. Are the calculations correct? Zeph A. asked, studying readings that transformed their planet into a weapon of unimaginable destructive potential. The mathematics are elegant, Kielara replied, her scientific mind both horrified and fascinated by what they were about to attempt. The planetary magnetic field, properly modulated, can generate a focused gravitational pulse. Effective range approximately 1 million kilometers. Projected impact. Anything not anchored to a major gravitational source will be displaced. Displaced where? That depends on their position relative to local space-time curvature at the moment of activation. Some will be pushed into interstellar space. Others, She paused, consulting calculations that hurt to contemplate. Others will be pushed into the system's star. Mordin joined them at the control station, his warrior's pragmatism cutting through scientific fascination. And our allies. The human ships are too close to the planet's surface. The gravitational anchoring should be sufficient. Should be? Kilara's breathing apparatus, misted with rapid exhalations. The interaction between their quantum drive systems and our gravitational pulse is theoretical. We've never tested anything like this before. Then we're about to conduct the ultimate experiment, HFY said grimly. How long until the grid is fully charged? 17 minutes. Above them, the space battle raged with increasing intensity. Human ships danced between collective vessels like fighters engaging heavy artillery, using speed and unpredictability to offset overwhelming firepower disadvantage, but even human ingenuity had limits, and those limits were rapidly approaching. Signal the human fleet, HFY commanded. Inform them of our capabilities and timeline. Let them decide whether to trust us with their lives. The message reached Cross at the worst possible moment, just as the Indomitable absorbed a direct hit from a collective bioweapon that turned 3 decks into something resembling the inside of a digesting stomach. Sir, Park shouted over the sound of emergency klaxons and automatic fire suppression systems. The Veltar are requesting immediate tactical conference. They claim to have a weapon capable of, sir, they claim they can clear the entire engagement zone. Cross looked around his bridge, taking in the damage reports that painted a picture of gradual but inevitable defeat. They had destroyed 18 collective vessels, but had lost 3 ships of their own, and the remaining 5 were operating at steadily decreasing efficiency. Put them through. HFY's elongated features appeared on the main display, his compound eyes reflecting what appeared to be profound regret. Captain Cross, we possess a planetary defense system that can eliminate the collective fleet. But the gravitational effects, your ships may not survive the discharge. What are odds? Unknown. The connection between human quantum drive technology and our gravitational pulse generators has never been tested. You could be displaced into interstellar space, or we could be pushed into the sun. Cross completed the thought with the calm acceptance of someone who had always known how his story would end. How long until you can fire? 14 minutes. Cross studied his tactical display one final time, watching as probability curves painted pictures of inevitable defeat. The mathematics were clear. They could continue fighting and guarantee their destruction, or trust their allies and accept a possibility of survival. All ships. This is actual, he transmitted across the fleet channels. In 13 minutes, our Veltar allies are going to attempt something that has never been tried before. It might save us. It might kill us. Anyone who wants to try breaking out of the engagement zone has my permission to do so. The response came in the form of engine signatures, his remaining ships moving into closer formation rather than dispersing. Negative on the withdrawal, Captain, came the voice of Commander Harrison from the destroyer Resolute. We came here to stand with our allies. That doesn't change just because the mathematics got complicated. Cross felt something that might have been pride if pride could exist in the face of almost certain annihilation. Very well. All ships, prepare for gravitational displacement. Emergency power to inertial dampeners. And it's been an honor serving with you. The planetary defense grid activated with a sound like reality tearing. What happened next would be debated by physicists for generations, assuming any physicist survived to debate it. The planet's magnetic field amplified and focused through exotic matter conduits that existed partially outside normal spacetime, generated a gravitational pulse that propagated outward at speeds that made light seem sluggish. Space itself rippled. The collective fleet, caught in the expanding wave of twisted gravity, experienced forces that their bio-neural systems had no evolutionary response to. Vessels that had been designed to exist partially outside normal dimensions found themselves pulled back into conventional space-time and subjected to gravitational effects that exceeded their structural tolerances. Most were simply pushed away, hurled into interstellar space at velocities that would require centuries to overcome. But 17 ships, caught at precisely the wrong angle relative to local gravitational sources, found themselves on new trajectories that terminated in the system's star. The bioneural networks that had been their greatest advantage became their weakness, as living components tried to process sensory input from inside a stellar core. The human ships, anchored by their proximity to Keth Mori's gravitational field, rode out the pulse with damage that was extensive but not fatal. Emergency power to inertial dampeners prevented crews from being liquefied. Quantum drive systems, pushed beyond their design parameters, somehow maintained integrity through engineering principles that would probably be declared classified if anyone lived to analyze them. When the gravitational storm finally subsided, 8 human ships floated in orbit around a world that had just demonstrated why some weapons should never be used. Of the collective fleet, nothing remained but expanding clouds of exotic matter that would dissipate into background radiation within days. Sekthar died badly. His flagship, caught at the epicenter of the gravitational pulse, had been pushed into a trajectory that intersected the system's star within 14 seconds of displacement. His bio-neural systems, evolved to process reality across multiple dimensions, found themselves trying to analyze sensory input from inside a nuclear furnace. His final transmission, broadcast across collective communication networks before stellar plasma consumed his ship's quantum communication array, consisted of a single word that would haunt his species for generations: impossible. Victory. It turned out, was heavier than defeat. In the aftermath of the gravitational pulse, space around Keth Mori held the strange quiet that follows violence, a silence so complete it seemed to possess weight of its own. 8 human ships floated in orbits that had been mathematically impossible 20 minutes earlier, their hulls scarred by weapons that existed partially outside normal space-time, their crews struggling to process what they had witnessed. Captain Cross stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, studying damage reports that painted a picture of survival measured in microseconds and luck. 3 decks remained sealed due to bioweapon contamination. The quantum drive showed stress fractures that would require a complete rebuild, and the gravitational effects had done something to the ship's chronometers that made time itself seem unreliable. But they were alive. All of them. The first indication that their victory might be incomplete came 18 hours later, in the form of sensor readings that shouldn't have been possible. Lieutenant Fisher was the first to detect them, quantum signatures emerging from the outer system, moving in patterns that seemed familiar yet wrong. "Captain," he announced, his young voice carrying the strain of someone who had seen too much in too short a time. "I'm reading multiple contacts on long-range sensors, collective biosignatures, but different." Cross moved to the sensor station, studying readouts that transformed probability into mathematics. "Different how?" "The quantum resonance is shifted. Lower frequency, broader spectrum. It's like..." Fisher paused, struggling to find words for something that violated his understanding of physics. "It's like the ships we destroyed are echoing, reflecting back from somewhere else." The main display flickered, resolving into images that made Cross's blood run cold. Ships, dozens of them, possessing the writhing organic architecture of collective vessels, but moving with a precision that seemed almost mechanical, and at their center a flagship that was both familiar and terrifyingly different. Sekthar's vessel had been consumed by stellar fire, its bioneural systems cooked to plasma by temperatures that exceeded the core of most stars. But somehow, impossibly, it had returned, transformed by forces that no conventional understanding of physics could explain. "It's not possible," Park said, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone reciting fundamental laws. "Nothing can survive direct exposure to stellar nuclear fusion. The temperatures alone would disrupt matter at the subatomic level." Cross studied the approaching fleet with growing unease. 47 vessels, all showing the characteristic biosignatures of collective technology, yet moving in formation patterns that suggested coordination beyond even their usual hive mind capabilities. "Unless survival isn't the right concept," he said finally. On Keth Mori's surface, in the deepest bunkers beneath crystalline spires that had been cracked by gravitational forces beyond calculation, HFY stood before sensor displays that transformed nightmare into data. "They're returning," Correa said, her scientific mind struggling to process readings that violated every principle of causality she had spent her life studying. "The same ships, the same quantum signatures, as if our gravitational pulse simply bounced them back." "Impossible." "More done," stated with the flat certainty of someone whose survival had always depended on understanding tactical realities. The displacement vectors were confirmed. Most of the fleet was pushed into interstellar space at velocities that would require centuries to overcome. The remainder was directed into our star, where they were destroyed at the molecular level. Yet they return. HFY said quietly, his compound eyes reflecting displays that painted space in shades of impossibility. Changed, but present. The question becomes, what are we facing now? The answer came in the form of a transmission that broadcast across every communication frequency simultaneously. A message that carried harmonics no living throat could produce. We have been educated. The voice belonged to Sekthar, but transformed by experiences that had taken place inside stellar fire, where his words had once carried the predatory confidence of an apex hunter. They now possessed something approaching transcendence. The calm certainty of someone who had died and discovered that death was merely another form of existence. You showed us something beyond evolution. The transmission continued, its harmonics causing crystalline structures throughout the bunker to resonate in frequencies that hurt to hear. Beyond adaptation, beyond the limitations of conventional space-time. We thank you. On the main display, Sektor's flagship moved through space in patterns that seemed to bend light around its hull. The vessel that had been consumed by stellar fire now incorporated elements of that fire into its structure. Plasma conduits that pulsed with the rhythm of nuclear fusion. Hull sections that existed at temperatures that should have vaporized everything within a 1,000-kilometer radius. We are no longer bound by the crude limitations of biology, Sektar announced, his transformed voice carrying across the void with the authority of someone who had discovered fundamental truths about the nature of existence. Your gravitational weapon taught us that space and time are merely suggestions, parameters to be overcome rather than obeyed. The implications hit Cross like a kinetic round to the chest. They didn't survive the stellar impact, he said, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone reciting their own death sentence. They were transformed by it, turned into something that exists partially outside conventional physics. Park's fingers moved across her console with the desperate speed of someone hoping that more data might somehow change the fundamental nature of reality. Bioneural signatures are evolved. The transformation appears to have accelerated their adaptive capabilities by several orders of magnitude. They're not just learning from our tactics, they're incorporating them into their basic structure. On the main display, the approaching collective fleet demonstrated their new capabilities by performing maneuvers that violated conservation of momentum. Ships that had been pushed into their system's star and somehow survived the experience now moved through space as if gravitational fields were merely suggestions to be ignored. Weapons status? Cross asked, though he already knew the answer. All systems operational. But sir, the tactical officer's voice carried the strain of someone processing impossible mathematics. Their new configurations appear to be resistant to quantum torpedo effects. The stellar transformation seems to have given them defensive capabilities against weapons that attack fundamental reality. Cross studied the tactical display with the calm focus of someone who had always known that his story would end badly. 8 human ships against 47 vessels that had been improved by experiences that should have destroyed them completely. The mathematics were unforgiving, and this time there were no gravitational weapons to alter the equation. Signal the Veltar Command Center, he ordered. Ask if they have any more impossible weapons in their arsenal. The response came back within minutes, carrying the bitter taste of finality. The planetary defense grid requires 72 hours to recharge. We have no other weapons of comparable capability. Cross looked around his bridge, studying faces that had become as familiar as family over their years together. They had come here to stand with their allies, and they had succeeded beyond all reasonable expectations. But success, it seemed, had simply raised the stakes for the next round. All ships, this is actual, he transmitted across the fleet channels. The enemy has returned with capabilities we don't understand and can't counter. Anyone who wants to evacuate to the planet's surface has 10 minutes to do so. The responses came back immediately, not in words but in the subtle sounds of crews settling deeper into their stations. They would stand. They would fight. They would face the impossible together. The second battle began not with weapons but with words that carried the weight of transformed understanding. You fight to preserve. Sector broadcast across the engagement zone, his voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond normal spacetime. We have learned to Your gravitational weapon showed us that the boundaries between matter and energy, between existence and void, are merely artificial constructs. The transformed collective fleet moved with a grace that defied conventional physics. Ships that had been forged in stellar fire now incorporated that fire into their basic structure, moving through space trailing coronas of contained plasma that turned the void around them into something resembling the heart of a star. They're not using conventional propulsion, Fisher reported, his voice carrying the strain of someone trying to navigate by instruments that no longer provided reliable readings. The stellar transformation appears to have given them the ability to manipulate local space-time directly. Cross watched the approaching fleet with growing fascination despite the circumstances. The enemy had been transformed by forces that should have destroyed them, turned into something that existed partially outside the conventional understanding of physics. In a strange way, it was almost beautiful. If beauty could be found in something that intended to harvest every living thing in the system. Your species possesses remarkable qualities, Sector continued, his transformed flagship moving into weapons range with the casual inevitability of gravity itself. The ability to achieve effects far beyond apparent capabilities. The willingness to sacrifice individual survival for collective goals. These traits will be preserved when you join us. The first shot came not from weapons but from the transformed ship's hull itself. A beam of contained stellar plasma that turned a section of space into something resembling the interior of a star. The target, the destroyer Valiant, simply ceased to exist in any conventional sense. Its matter converted into energy states that had no names in any known language. The human response was immediate and personal. Every remaining ship focused fire on Sectar's flagship, pouring energy into its hull with the concentrated fury of people who had just watched friends die. But the weapons that had been so effective against conventional collective vessels seemed to have no impact on ships that had been forged in stellar fire. Railgun slugs traveling at 20% light speed simply vaporized when they contacted the transformed hull's plasma corona. Quantum torpedoes, weapons that attacked the fundamental nature of reality, found their targets no longer bound by the conventional laws of existence. They're immune to our weapons, Park reported, her voice carrying the clinical detachment of someone providing updates on an unavoidable disaster. The stellar transformation appears to have rendered them essentially invulnerable to conventional attack. Cross studied the tactical display with growing desperation. This was the nightmare scenario that strategists had theorized, but hoped never to face, an enemy that had transcended the normal limitations of physics and become essentially invulnerable to retaliation. But humans had never been conventional. All ships, he commanded, prepare for ramming speed. What followed would be remembered as either the most heroic or most suicidal action in the history of interstellar warfare. 7 human ships abandoned every principle of tactical doctrine and accelerated directly toward the transformed collective fleet. Not to engage in conventional combat but to physically ram vessels that existed partially outside normal space-time. The physics should have been straightforward, matter meeting matter at relativistic velocities, with results that could be calculated using equations that had been known for centuries. But the collective ships were no longer bound by conventional physics. The first impact came when the cruiser Defiance struck a transformed enemy vessel at 17% of light speed. The collision should have resulted in mutual annihilation, converting both ships into expanding clouds of plasma and exotic particles. Instead, something far stranger occurred. The moment of contact seemed to stretch across subjective hours. Time itself appeared to slow, then accelerate, then reverse direction entirely. The Defiant and its target existed simultaneously as separate vessels and as a single merged entity, as matter and energy, as past and future configurations of the same fundamental reality. When the temporal distortion finally stabilized, both ships were gone. Not destroyed but translated into something that existed beyond conventional space-time. Their crew's final transmissions consisted of words that would puzzle physicists for generations. We can see everything. We can see the connections. They're not being destroyed, Fisher reported, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone whose fundamental understanding of reality had been systematically demolished. They're being transformed, converted into the same state as the collective ships. Cross watched in fascination and horror as the pattern repeated itself across the engagement zone. Human ships making ramming attacks that resulted not in destruction but in transformation. Crews and vessels converted into something that existed partially outside normal physics. "Now you begin to understand," Sekdar transmitted, his voice carrying what might have been satisfaction if satisfaction could exist in states beyond conventional emotion. "There is no victory or defeat, only evolution, only transcendence." On Kethmorai's surface, HFY made a decision that would echo across the galaxy for millennia. "Activate the emergency quantum beacon," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of civilizations that had trusted him to make impossible choices. "All frequencies. Maximum power." Kilara looked up from her sensor displays with something approaching horror. "Sir, the power requirements will drain our planetary defense systems completely. If we activate the beacon, we'll have no weapons, no shields, no way to fight," HFY completed. "But perhaps a way to ensure that what happened here is remembered." The quantum beacon was ancient technology, a communications system designed to broadcast messages across galactic distances with enough power to penetrate dimensional barriers and temporal distortions. It had been built during the early days of interstellar civilization, when species had first begun to understand that some events were too important to be lost to the limitations of conventional spacetime. "What message shall we send?" Morden asked, his warriors' pragmatism warring with the growing certainty that their story was approaching its conclusion. HFY studied the displays that showed space around their world transforming into something beyond conventional understanding. Human and collective vessels merging into entities that existed partially outside normal reality. Crews being converted into states of being that had no names in any known language. "The truth," he said finally. "All of it. The human sacrifice. The collective transformation. The implications of what we've witnessed. Let the galaxy decide what to do with the knowledge." The quantum beacon activated with a pulse of energy that briefly outshone their system's star. The message it carried: technical specifications, tactical analyses, philosophical implications, and most importantly, the record of human ships choosing transformation over retreat, propagated across the galaxy at speeds that made light seem stationary. Within hours, every major civilization would know what had happened at Kethmorai. Within days, the implications would begin to reshape galactic politics. Within years, the search would begin for ways to contact the entities that human and collective crews had become. The final transformation came not as conquest but as invitation. The last human ship, the Indomitable itself, faced a choice that no military doctrine had prepared it for. Ahead lay Sekdar's flagship and the transformed remnants of both fleets, entities that existed in states beyond conventional understanding, yet somehow retained the essential characteristics that had defined them in conventional reality. "Join us," came the transmission, broadcast simultaneously by voices that had once belonged to human crews and collective bio-neural networks. "See what we have seen. Understand what we have learned." Cross stood on his bridge, studying displays that showed his ship surrounded by entities that had transcended the normal limitations of physics. His crew looked to him for orders that he couldn't give because the situation they faced existed beyond the scope of conventional military decision-making. "Sir," Park said quietly, "the transformed vessels aren't attacking, they're waiting." Cross studied the sensor readings with growing understanding. The entities surrounding them possessed the capability to force transformation. They had demonstrated that clearly enough, but they were choosing to offer it instead, extending an invitation to transcend conventional existence rather than compelling it. "Captain," came a new voice over the communication channels, one that carried the unmistakable inflections of Commander Harrison from the Resolute, though somehow transformed by experiences that existed beyond normal spacetime. "We can see everything. The connections between matter and energy, between space and time, between individual consciousness and collective understanding. It's beautiful." Cross looked around his bridge one final time, studying faces that had become family over their years together. They had come here to stand with their allies, and they had achieved something beyond their wildest expectations, not victory but evolution. "All hands," he announced over the ship's internal communication system. "This is the captain. We face a choice that no human crew has ever confronted. We can remain as we are, bound by the conventional limitations of physics and mortality, or we can choose to transcend those limitations, to become something greater than the sum of our individual parts. The pause that followed was filled with the steady hum of life support systems and the subtle vibration of engines that had carried them across impossible distances. "The choice is individual," Cross continued. "Anyone who wishes to remain in conventional existence can transfer to the escape pods. No judgment, no consequences. But anyone who chooses to stay," he paused, watching displays that showed space around them transformed into something that resembled a galaxy-wide neural network. "Anyone who chooses to stay becomes part of something that we can't yet understand." The response came in the form of silence. Not empty silence, but the profound quiet of people who had found their answer. Not a single crew member moved to the escape pods. "Very well," Kor said, his voice carrying the calm acceptance of someone who had always known how his story would end. "Signal our intent to the transformed fleet. We accept their invitation." The transformation, when it came, was nothing like death and everything like birth. In the Deep Space Monitoring Station at Alpha Centauri, Dr. Elizabeth Kane studied sensor readings that defied every principle of astrophysics she had spent her life learning. The HFY system had become something unprecedented. A region of space where the normal laws of physics were merely suggestions to be transcended rather than obeyed. Ships that existed partially outside conventional spacetime moved through the void in patterns that seemed almost musical, while energy signatures suggested the presence of intelligence operating on scales that dwarfed planetary civilizations. "Are they still human?" her research partner asked, studying data streams that transformed impossibility into mathematics. Kane looked at the quantum communication array, which occasionally received transmissions from the transformed entities, messages that carried philosophical insights, scientific discoveries, and most remarkably, expressions of continued loyalty to the species they had once belonged to. The latest transmission, received just 3 hours earlier, had been brief but profound. "We remember who we were. We understand what we have become. We watch over what we still love." "Yes," Kane said finally, her voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had dedicated her life to understanding the impossible. "They're still human. They're just more above them, invisible to conventional sensors but detectable through quantum resonance analysis. Something that had once been the Indomitable maintained a patrol pattern that encompassed 17 star systems. A guardian presence that existed beyond normal space-time, protecting civilizations that would never know it was there. The war that had brought them to HFY was over. But the peace they had found was just beginning. In the vast catalogue of human achievement, there are moments that transcend individual heroism to become something approaching mythology. The stand at HFY would be remembered not as a victory of weapons over weapons, but as the day humanity chose transformation over retreat, evolution over preservation, and love over survival itself. They thought no aid was coming. They were wrong. But in ways they never could have imagined, they were also right. Some forms of salvation change everything, including the meaning of salvation itself.